Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language currently teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, previously at UCLA, but as of August 2017, very happy to be returning home to teach at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm back today with another one of my videos about a topic in Norse language and myth, and today I'm still answering questions posed by Patreon supporters on my Patreon page. Supporter Todd Robertson asks, if the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda are our main sources of Norse mythology, what are the secondary sources? Well, there are several other sources that we can look at from the Middle Ages, but none of them offer the same kind of comprehensive look at the myths of the Norse gods and heroes that the Poetic and Prose Edda do. One important source is Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish writer who was roughly contemporaneous with Snorri Sturluson in Iceland. Saxo Grammaticus, which would also be the name of a great ska band, wrote a book called Gesta Danorum, History of the Danes, and the first 9 books or so talk about legendary history, including some legendary early kings, and often the gods. Saxo is much more hostile to the pagan gods than Snorri is. Snorri is really notable for how tolerant he is toward his people's pre-Christian beliefs. But Saxo still preserves some important myths in variant forms, including the myth of the death of Balder, which he tells in a very different form, which I've discussed in my video about Balder, which I will post a link to in a card in the top right of the screen. Saxo also preserves a different version of the myth of Utgarda Loki and some other important myths, in addition to some stories about the early Danish kings that reinforce what we read about them in Icelandic sources, sometimes including visits to them by the gods, especially Odin. There is also Adam of Bremen, another European continental writer who in the very late 11th century wrote a history of the church in Northern Europe. There he talks about the temple at Uppsala in Sweden, which he knew someone who, I think, knew someone who had seen. And that's one of our most important sources for how the Norse gods might have been worshipped, something I've also talked about in another video that I'll link in the top right of the screen. Then back in Iceland, there are sources such as Heimskringla, the History of the Kings of Norway, another work by Snorri Sturluson. The first saga in Heimskringla is called Ynglinga Saga, and concerns the divine ancestry of the Norwegian royal family. In this saga, Snorri tells some strikingly different myths about the gods he discusses in his Prose Edda. His picture of Odin, for instance, is pretty different. Ynglinga Saga can be found in the translation of Heimskringla that's been done by Alison Finlay and Anthony Fawkes, and is available on the the Viking Society for Northern Research webpage. Other sagas also talk about the Norse gods. The Saga of the Volsungs, my translation of which will be available in September, and my recap of which has been posted recently on this YouTube channel. Again, that's something I'll link in the top right. The Saga of the Volsungs has especially the god Odin as a major character, and mentions some other gods as well. Other sagas that mention gods include the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, although the gods aren't actually characters in that. The saga of Eroad, which again, the gods aren't actually characters, but they are mentioned. One of the most important sagas that actually does have the gods as characters is Gautrek's saga, in which Odin and Thor compete, sort of. Odin gives a hero some blessings, which Thor counters with his curses. There are also Skaldic Poems, which record myths of the Norse gods. Usually these are told in very elusive form. The Skaldic poems are much more complicated than the poems in the Poetic Edda, and are usually preserved one at a time in the original context in which they were composed in sagas of Icelanders or sagas of kings. Usually a Skaldic poem was composed to honor a particular king or particular hero, and sometimes this king or hero will be honored by reference to some kind of myth about a god or mythic hero, or sometimes something like the hero's shield may be described, and the shield may have some scene from myth. Since Skaldic poems can be dated very precisely, anytime that we have a myth hinted at in an early Skaldic poem, that's a very valuable resource for us because it shows us that the myth is, in fact, however old the Skaldic poem is, which is often much older than our other written sources. Outside of Scandinavia, there are some minor sources. In Germany, the Merseburg charms preserve a little bit of pre-Christian myth, including the names of gods such as Odin and Old High German Wotan and Balder. In England, there's the Nine Herbs charm, which involves Odin in a magic healing charm. But without the Poetic and the Prose Edda, all of this would really just be sort of piecemeal evidence that would point us toward the names of some gods and a little bit about their characters, especially the character of Odin and Thor, but wouldn't actually tell us much about their myths and who they were and their significance in the culture. So we are very lucky to have the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda and their much grander vision and more complete vision of the Norse gods, and that is why I focus on the Eddas and talking about Norse myth. Well, from the wilderness of the American West, I'm wishing you all the best, and thanking you again for your interest and questions.